Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us on today's broadcast on the Internet of Things. This webcast is a joint initiative with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and the Center for Internet Security. We would like to thank DHS for their partnership with us in this effort. I'm pleased to say that we have more than 500 registrants representing all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and the U.S. Territory of Puerto Rico today. Our topic for today's MSISAC National Webcast is the Internet of Things. After experimenting with many common items that make up the Internet of Insecure Things, our presenter will share his findings on how to best secure and enjoy this newly wired world. He will talk about the underlying assumptions these devices make, common methods they utilize to communicate, and what type of information is at risk. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker today. Chester Wisniewski has been involved in the information security space since the late 1980s. He currently works for the Office of the CTO at Sophos and divides his time between research, public speaking, writing, and attempting to communicate the complexities of security to the press and public in a way that they can understand. Chester has spoken at RSA, InfoSec Europe, LISA, Usenix, and many other events around the world, in addition to regularly consulting with NPR, CNN, CBC, the New York Times, and other media outlets. Chester, thank you for participating in today's event. I'll turn things over to you now.
Great, thank you very much for that. And hopefully everyone can see my slides now. Thanks for joining us this afternoon, although I guess, as Jessica said, I guess some of you are from Alaska and Hawaii, so a couple hours behind us for the trailing side, but I'm coming to you today from Vancouver, and I'll briefly begin by just kind of explaining what I do and kind of how I've come at looking at the Internet of Things. You can see on the slide there, I end up doing a lot of speaking, and a lot of my job is trying to combine research with speaking, which makes it incredibly difficult actually, because it requires traveling a lot. So that you can see in the upper right of the slide there, that's kind of my lab at this point. I'm addicted to the cloud now, because not only am I in the cloud flying around the world all the time going to events, but I end up doing a lot of my research from the cloud. I was actually flying back from Europe this week, and I had a solid 9.5 hours with Wi-Fi on Lufthansa to tie into my cloud servers where I do a lot of my research, because obviously I can't take along everything with me. And I did see in the attendee list there's a few DHS members there. I've gotten quite a few frowns from carrying around 11 smart light bulbs and all these other things that I've been testing and playing with. So I've discovered it's a lot easier to plug this stuff in and access it remotely than it is to carry it in your carry-on luggage. So at least a tip if you're going to play with these things. You don't really get into trouble, but you pack enough electronics in a carry-on and it's going to become a lot more interesting than your normal travel day. My job, though, at Sophos really is to do those two things. It's kind of to look at emerging technologies, research what's going on out there and what presents potential risks to our organization, and then try to come up with practical solutions for our customers, our prospects, and just the general public to be able to protect themselves. And clearly one thing that does is inform what we may do with our products to try to protect people. But more than that, my role is kind of separate from that. My role is really an educational role to work with you and share what we've learned. Now, IoT is a pretty big topic, and I want to kind of define how I'm approaching it, at least for the purposes of what we're talking about here today. I wouldn't disagree that some of the things you see there on the screen may be considered IoT now, although I kind of think about it a little differently. Clearly, when we look at things like oil wells and the energy sector, or even in the lower left there, a lot of transportation stuff, there's a lot of embedded monitoring devices that are now being connected to the internet. Historically, we've referred to those things as industrial control systems, or ICS. We've referred to them as SCADA. We've called them many different things, but they're not exactly new. What's new, I guess, or not even necessarily new for those things, is that they're being hooked up to the internet. And those devices weren't designed for the internet necessarily. They were designed to be used on isolated and closed networks. And so we're seeing similar similar vulnerabilities, similar insecurities in those things that we see in more consumer-oriented devices. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it fits into the same category. I think the struggle we have with worrying about our power distribution infrastructure, et cetera, is a different set of solutions and controls that need to be in place than per se what we might think about for things that we're buying at Best Buy and bringing into our home or workplace that way. I also decided to throw the Tesla in there just because, well, I like looking at Teslas. But more than that, I consider anything that you're spending tens of thousands of dollars on not to really be a thing. You know, these devices all have their way more complexity, I guess, is really the issue than we have with some of the more basic IoT, and we're not likely to present risk to an average organization because somebody drives a Tesla to work. What I'm really concerned about when I'm looking at things are more along the lines of what you see in this slide here, right? We're talking about the smart light bulbs, everything having a camera in it these days, whether it be that television at the bottom or the actual webcam or nanny cam or, you know, these types of things that you see there at the top. Clearly we have technology creeping into every part of our lives, like children's toys, you know, these types of things, not to mention things that kind of cross over between the previous slide, in my opinion, and this, which is like smart home appliances, in particular when we're talking about heating and cooling systems or HVAC systems, major appliances like washers and dryers. These things, I think, provide an opportunity that we need to consider both the micro risk, the risk to us as individuals, or what might happen if these were put into our network environments in our workplace, but we also need to understand the macro risk of them, in that what kind of risk might they present to society as a whole if there was a mass hack of them, for example, and I'll talk about that in a little more detail further along in the presentation. I do have to warn everyone, I have a little bit of a cold today, so I may go silent for a mysterious few seconds while I press my own cough button so I don't injure all of your ears. So when I started looking at this, it was sort of a science project at work. We had been hearing more and more online about insecure IoT devices. We had a lot of customers and people that we're talking to that were asking questions about them, wanting to know more. So we started writing a lot of blog articles on our Naked Security blog, trying to share information about what we were hearing, and wanted to go a little further. So before I began, I kind of sat down and said, where should I start, right? I need to look at, there's so many different moving parts, or if you're in the security field like I am, we think of things in terms of attack surface. How big of a surface area does a thing have that we can attack it from? And I literally started this out about a year ago, and I went to Google, and you can see that screenshot there in the middle of the picture. I went to Google and I typed IoT security, just out of curiosity to see what had been published, what information was out there. And the top result, if you're feeling lucky, was this IoT.do website. And I clicked the button, of course, it was the top result. And what did I get? I got an invalid security certificate to the site that was going to tell me about Internet of Things security. And because you can't make these things up, I decided I had to screenshot it, because it's a bad sign when you're looking for information about how to secure something and the top Google result is giving you security warnings, because if you see the detail there, the certificate is only valid for example.com, so they couldn't be bothered to use a proper security certificate on a website about security. So obviously I wrote that off as maybe not being the best resource, but I didn't find a lot of information that wasn't commercially driven. And even though I work for a commercial company, I find that very irritating, because I want to get what I feel to be honest information that I can use as a starting point for my own research. So instead, I talked to my colleagues, I talked to my boss, and we kind of came up with a short list of the attack surfaces available, really, and that's what the bullet points are there, right? There's certainly shared operating systems amongst many of these devices, lots of them running Linux or embedded operating system, real-time operating system components to work on these very cost-effective, tiny little chips in many of them. Of course, almost all of them are wireless, so there's ways to potentially attack or manipulate the wireless protocols used. And And certainly ones that use Wi-Fi are most familiar to those of us that are in IT security, because we all study Wi-Fi security to a degree. But there's a lot more complexity here, right? There's things like Zigbee and a lot of other standards that are used, again, because they're low cost, lightweight, and low power consumption for a lot of these embedded devices. There's the applications themselves, and that sort of has two components. There's the application you may use to control it, like often there would be an iPhone application or Android application that may interface with these devices. But there's also the application running on the thing itself, right? There's software running on the webcam beyond just the operating system that may have an attack surface. There's the communication. And I assume with as technical audiences I saw in the list, many of us have played with these things at home and recognize that they kind of rely on the cloud often, or they rely on some sort of more powerful computer that's going to process and distribute the information from the given webcam or light bulb or whatever thing it might be. And then, of course, there's also the physical security of the devices. And I saw something, I think it was in Wired magazine, I know we wrote about it as well a few weeks ago, about one of these smart door locks that you can get for your home, and by interfacing with it with a USB cable, you could get the Wi-Fi password for the Wi-Fi network of the premises it was installed at. That's a physical attack, and by having access to it, I can now manipulate it to do things it wasn't designed to do, which is sort of the definition of hacking. So with that established, I kind of decided on my approach, and this is kind of where I ended up, looking at the diversity of these things and trying to figure out which ones were going to be the most interesting. So I went to my boss and got some budget, went and bought a bunch of these devices, and I can't name everything I tested on. And during the Q&A, feel free to ask me questions. I'm not going to necessarily single out any given vendor or thing like that. I don't know that it's that important, but I did test out a series of things that used a lot of these technologies you see there. Just the wireless ones and operating systems and things are listed in that little word cloud. And I think this kind of presents the good and the bad, as I say in the title there. If you think about something like the ubiquity of something, often, of course, if you find a flaw, that makes it easier to fix all of them at once. And I think the perfect example of that is your iPhone. If you've got an iOS device, an iPad, or an iPhone, when we find a new vulnerability in iPhone and Apple learns about it, they can very quickly patch just about every iPhone in the world, because there's only a few versions of it, there's only a couple that are supported, they all run the same software. We find one thing, we can fix all of them. Of course, the problem there, as was recently brought up in the press so much about the Apple versus FBI problem, is that once there's a flaw found, then if you aren't able to fix it, every single one of them is vulnerable and they're all the same. So it's very easy to attack it as an attacker. One crafted attack typically will take down that entire ecosystem. In the Internet of Things, I think we're more in an Android world. In the Android world, we've got tens of manufacturers, thousands of different devices. And as a result, very few of them are ever patched and up to date. And that's certainly the experience I had with the IoT things I tested. All of them were vulnerable. But the good thing about it, strangely, is they were all uniquely vulnerable. And that presents a much less appealing thing for a criminal. Somebody who's looking to exploit and target these devices wants to hit all of them. I don't want to just hit one brand of Samsung Android phone because it has a flaw. I want to hit all Android phones because that's how I'm going to make money, or that's how I'm going to present the risk to the network that I want to demonstrate. And the same, I think, is true with IoT. I'm not sure I'd want to just target one webcam. I'd like to hit all of them. And because of the diversity of protocols, operating systems, and application platforms, there's little risk, I think, of a mass hack the way we might see with Windows or iPhones, where there's a lot of ubiquity in our world, and or as we've seen with vulnerabilities and things like OpenSSL with Heartbleed, where suddenly millions of web servers have a problem all at once. So sometimes all of this diversity is good. It's not a particularly good thing when you're trying to do research, sadly. So my goals in my research were, I really want to find practical advice that we could share with you, and that's one of the reasons my title slide said that I was kind of trying to share what I've learned, because sadly, because of that diversity that I just talked about, there's really not one common thing that I can share, and there's, you know, a silver bullet, if you will, right? Gosh, every device I looked at had some different kind of problem that I need to consider in a different way. And I looked at smart door locks, I looked at webcams, I looked at light bulbs, I looked at the gadgets I purchased to play with. You know, it was a pretty diverse group, and what we want to be able to do is kind of survey them, see if there's common vulnerabilities, what kind of mistakes are vendors making. Then that might help us identify mitigations, right? We maybe can't patch the smart light bulb in our environment, but we certainly can try to do something to isolate it, prevent it from being exploited, preventing it from presenting a risk in our networks. We might want to identify where they are. So if there's some common things about them that we can identify, we can maybe in a business environment use some of our traditional IT security tools to identify if these things are in our network. So maybe there's a way to identify them by using our IDS or IPS rules, or maybe we can use other network survey tools and things like that, that when we're scanning the network, not just identify Windows PCs and Macs and servers, but also go, wait a minute, somebody's brought some smart device into the network and we found it when we were doing our Nessus scan, say, something like that. And then, of course, use whatever I find in the research to both share it with you in the public, but also maybe with regulators, because this is a pretty Wild West area right now, and these things are proliferating very, very quickly. I mean, there's hundreds of thousands of IoT devices out there, and that's kind of a problem, right? Because there's no consensus on what should be done, or often there's a mistaken belief that this thing is somewhat harmless, what could go wrong? And the example of that I think best fits was the Wi-Fi tea kettle, and that's a very British thing, I realize. Sophos is a British company, and we heard of this IoT Wi-Fi tea kettle, and I guess the concept is that you bring it into the office and connect it to Wi-Fi, and then you have it in you have water in it in the break room, and you're at your desk and you're like, oh, I think I'd like a cup of tea in 5 minutes. So you open the app up on your phone and you push the button and it turns the tea kettle on. And then when your water's ready to make your tea, it jingles on your iPhone, and oh, the water's ready, and you go to the break room and you can make your tea. I don't really know who needs this, but that's another whole issue with IoT. I found a smart egg tray as well that you can check how many eggs you have in the refrigerator. Some very weird things out there. But that smart tea kettle, as smart as it allegedly was, has a vulnerability in it. And by remotely poking at it, you can get it to disclose the pre-shared key for the Wi-Fi access, the WPA2 pre-shared key. That's a really big problem in a business environment. It may even be a problem in your home environment. And certainly those are the kinds of things we want to look at going, well, I probably don't want that at work at all. But if somebody does bring it in, make sure it's on, say, the guest network where the password's already posted on a poster every day at the front entry to the building, or that kind of thing. Try to keep it isolated from critical network functions, because obviously it cannot be trusted. So I started by looking at communications. How are these things working? Just did basic, sniffing kind of stuff. Everything I played with largely in some way back interfaced to the network. So it either used a protocol like Zigbee, but the little hub that you connect it to had an Ethernet port or connected to my Wi-Fi networks, or the device itself simply was on Wi-Fi or had an Ethernet port on it that allowed it to communicate that way. Of all the devices I tested, I believe I ended up with about 15 different things so far that I've tested. Not a single one used any encryption whatsoever to communicate across the internet. That's obviously a huge problem, depending on what type of information is being transmitted. But it's a huge problem at multiple different levels, right? It's not just a privacy issue. We think often about privacy and go, well, when it's the webcam of what's going on in the living room of my home, that's pretty creepy. I don't think I want anybody that can intercept my communication to see all of that. But there's also other types of things to consider when you look at that. If it's all unencrypted, then it also is unlikely necessarily to be authenticated. And if it's not authenticated, that means other people could impersonate you very easily and potentially control or manipulate those devices in undesirable ways. So that was a really big failure, and I was actually quite surprised. Now, one of the brands of smart light bulbs I tested used a lot of obfuscation, at least. The data wasn't like, in the packets wasn't turn light bulb off, make light bulb red, that kind of thing. It was, I don't know how to describe exactly. We'll just call it obfuscated. I was able to ultimately decipher most of what it was saying, but it took a significant amount of effort to bother to hack a light bulb. The other ones, on the other hand, were as dumb as I was saying. They did things like send your password in clear text over a plain HTTP connection across the internet. Knowing what we know about human nature sharing passwords, that's a really big problem. So the second thing I was looking at was, can I isolate these things, right? We make network gear at Sophos, so I was playing with a lot of our stuff. I had created isolated SSIDs. I had a Wi-Fi network called Chet's IoT that was just for playing with these things. I had set up a VLAN for the Ethernet ones. I had firewall rules locked down really tight, trying to figure out what could I safely have these things coexist alongside my work laptop and the type of work I do and be comfortable with these things being on my network. Almost everything I played with required some sort of app. And so if you're a consumer thinking about this and buying these things for your home, think about, what is the life of this thing? So a smart light bulb, I bought a kit of smart light bulbs, like a 3-pack with a little controller hub. And of course, an LED light bulb under normal usage, at least according to the manufacturer today, is about 20 years. So the fact that the only way I can control this smart light bulb is using a cloud service that requires an app on my iPhone or Android was a little concerning, because I'm wondering, is this smart light bulb company going to have an app for iOS version 31? And that type of thing, right? And also, will the cloud service still exist? Many of them were cloud dependent as well, and this has concerns for both home and corporate concerns, right? Because when we think about, there's no way to use this thing without it communicating with a third party, and it communicates insecurely, and it shares passwords in plain text. This makes it a much bigger risk as to whether you want this thing communicating on your network. And they're really challenging to control in a business environment because, as I mentioned, most of them use HTTP. Everything, in fact, used HTTP except for the webcam, which also used RTP, which is the real-time streaming protocol, or RTSP, which is a standard video protocol that's quite easy to intercept as well. And we don't typically block HTTP on our network unless it's a known malware destination or it's a phishing site or something, right? Or maybe for social contact controls. So that's another place to consider looking at your web filter vendor, and are they, you may want to ask them, do you have plans to identify the destinations for these IoT devices, the cloud hubs that operate them, and make it an optional control? Maybe I want to be able to disable that as a category, the same as I say you're not allowed to surf to pornographic websites, you're not allowed to go to sites about ISIS. I'm also going to say I'm going to block outbound web traffic to known IoT destinations, so that if somebody does bring one of these things into the office, perhaps it at least can't communicate with the destination and start leaking information. At home, it's a much bigger challenge because you've already purchased this thing. You may not know whether it's cloud dependent or not, and you don't find out until you buy it, and now you're kind of stuck relying on this third-party service that may or may not be secure. And those are the types of things that I hope and expect that the FTC may start looking into in the U.S. to help nudge manufacturers in the right direction about both product labeling, but also the security of these products to ensure that they meet that minimum standard that most of us expect. And the last item here, sadly, is another difficult one, which is these things are designed to be stupidly easy to use, which means they depend upon automatic things happening and the user not knowing anything. The user shouldn't need to know an IP address or what a DNS name is, or any of these types of things. So in order to facilitate that, they depend upon broadcasts and multicasts, or they would depend upon the firewall opening up ports through universal plug-and-play with your off-the-shelf home routers like you might get from Linksys or D-Link or Belkin. So both of those things, of course, are very dangerous. Universal plug-and-play being relied upon by these devices to get out to the internet means consumers must basically allow any malware or hacker to be able to just turn off their firewall, because the whole idea of universal plug-and-play is simply that anything can talk to the firewall and say, open up all these ports for me, which defeats the purpose of having a firewall, because it's sort of like having a security guard who reports to whomever asks him to do something, and when the burglar comes, he goes, hey, go take your lunch break. And that's pretty much what UPnP does. The other part of it means you cannot isolate these devices. So my smart light bulbs, when I put them on the IoT Wi-Fi network at my house, my phone was on my Google network at my house, and because of that, it meant I could no longer configure the smart light bulbs. I'm sorry, I said Google. Why did Google pop into my mind? My apologies for that, and my apologies to Google. It has nothing to do with Google. My normal home PC network, so my chat SSID instead of my chat IoT SSID, and because my phone was on my sort of private network and my IoT thing was on a separate network, the app couldn't find it because it relies on these broadcasts. So this means people must put them on the same network that their cell phone or their app is on, which again reduces security and reduces our options at minimizing risk, because we no longer have the option of going, I'm just going to put this thing in its own little sandbox, its own little playpen, and prevent it from harming other things. Now, I did see a couple questions come in. We'll leave time at the end to address the questions. Please feel free. Go ahead and type them in. And I love seeing them because it gives me time to noodle around in my head and think about a good response to your questions. So continually type those in, and we'll address them at the end. And I'll continue along. So the third part of this started just looking at all kinds of other concerns, and a bunch of things popped out. In particular, cameras and devices like that offer the ability to not need a cloud service. So one of the devices I bought allowed both a cloud mode and a non-cloud mode. And sadly, both were kind of a disaster. In the non-cloud mode, the web camera, for me to access it, required me to open 10,000 ports in my firewall. And it was non-configurable. So I couldn't go in and say, only use port 10,500 to 10,600. No, the device needs port 30,000 to 40,000, and that's that. And that's, ridiculous. I mean, again, I'm not sure what the point of a firewall is if you turn it off. So that was a little bad. And then the alternative to it was, well, or you can use our cloud service. And it identifies itself to the cloud service using its MAC address, which is printed on a sticker on the device. Which is, I guess, okay, sort of, as an initial login to access your camera. But it kind of got worse from there. The MAC addresses were issued serially, so I could type in anyone else's by just adding a number and incrementing it by 1 in hexadecimal. I could get all kinds of other people's cameras that hadn't changed the default password. Again, everything I tested had a default password, and none of them required it to be changed. Some of them prompted you and said, hey, you should change the password from 1, 2, 3, 4, but they didn't make me do it. Again, a very bad practice. When you're designing devices, you should never have a default password, period. The device should come up and go, hey, I'm brand new, configure me. What password would you like, sir? Oh, no, I'm sorry, I won't let you use password, that's unsafe. That would be a good design. None of them did that. And this particular one allowed you to have the default, but did warn you that others may be able to view your webcam. The second problem was it required a out-of-date Internet Explorer. It only worked with IE. So it actually took me quite a while to find a computer that I had that still had Internet Explorer 8 on it, so I could connect to the webcam in the cloud. And then it also required that I use a 2-year-old version of unpatched Java in order to view the video feed. So all of these things are indicative to me, not trying to shame a particular brand, but because I saw a lot of this kind of across the board in these devices, whether they're app controlled from a phone, whether they're this type of thing where you can connect to them from your PC, there seems to be ubiquity of we cobbled together some stuff that we found in the open source or we licensed from here, and we made it enough to say it's a functioning product and then we shipped it. There wasn't any consideration of security. The last thing, and in no way am I trying to go after Amazon here, but many of these cloud services rely on Amazon to provide their back-end connectivity. That also is really, really difficult from a filtering standpoint. Most of us can't put a filter onto our corporate network saying, yeah, we don't trust the Amazon cloud, because let's be fair, I mean, a third of the internet seems to run on Amazon's cloud these days. That's not a practical way to try to control devices. And good for Amazon. I'm assuming the popularity of these things using their services is good for their business model. But sadly for us, it means because it's sort of outsourced, it increases complexity for trying to potentially limit access and control these things. Now, I thought this was fun. I just thought I'd share some of the marketing. I'm always amused by the names of products, and so these were a couple of the things I tested. I won't name which ones had any which particular vulnerabilities, but nonetheless, I found the play on words quite fun. I have the Okie Dokies installed on my home door lock. One of the interesting things I did see with some of the smart door lock things, again, is around security, is assumptions. Some of these devices make assumptions about whether you maybe live in an urban community or a rural community, and maybe do insecure things as a result of that. I live in a condo tower, and so the one application I was playing with had a feature where it could automatically unlock my door within 100 meters, which is 130 yards, 120 yards of my door. Of course, when I'm at the park walking my dog, I'm within 100 meters of my condo, and I wouldn't necessarily want my door unlocked. So that was kind of an interesting side effect of some weird physical security things, I guess. The Hype brand light bulbs, which partly lived up to that expectation. We have the TCP brand light bulbs, which I can't imagine what brand you would want to use for a network-enabled light bulb that would beat the TCP brand light bulb. So common problems. Looking at these things at the high level, firewalling is definitely an issue. The good news, I guess, when we're talking about things like the webcam is if you don't open up the 10,000 ports, then arguably you break the thing, and that's good. You probably don't want video feeds from inside your organization or even your home necessarily going out. And there's some interesting ways to, if they're not cloud dependent, if you can use the thing without a cloud connection, that's kind of a nice advantage, I think. I have played quite a bit with the camera. I have it on my network right now, and I don't mind that because that means I have to connect to my own home in order to see it. That's weird because, of course, I don't need to see a camera feed of my home when I'm in my home. But in my case, at least, I just VPN into my home, and there's lots of cheap and easily accessible VPN-style tools that you can use at home to connect to inside of your network, and that gives me some comfort. But most of the time, firewalling these things is very hard, and they're either using lots of ports like many game consoles and things do. Xboxes and PlayStations often require a lot of holes to be open in your firewall, and sadly, these devices require that as well if you want to use their full functionality. Encryption is non-existent to speak of, so you do need to very carefully consider what type of information may be in those devices. And most commonly, the things that you need to be concerned about are Wi-Fi passwords, and so only connect into Wi-Fi networks that you kind of expect to be publicly available, whether that's a guest network in your home, whether that's a public network your company provides for guests that are visiting, that type of thing. In an enterprise environment, you should be using certificate authentication for your Wi-Fi anyhow. So if you're going to put a password into something, it should be something that you already consider to be insecure. But at home, that's a little more complicated and challenging. The little bottom right logo, that's meant to represent replay attacks. Because these devices don't use any encryption, they're vulnerable to replay attacks, which means they can pretty much be controlled by anyone at any time if they're communicating with the cloud. So in the case of the light bulbs, for example, that used a cloud service, I was able to simply do a packet capture of a legitimate transaction with the cloud to turn the lights off. And then I could replay that from anywhere in the world, from any computer, and it would turn the lights off. So there's really no authentication to speak of, and because the password was sent in plain text, I could authenticate anyway. It didn't matter. So those, you really have to make sure that they're in low security environments or isolated to the degree that you can, if their apps allow that. And the truth is there's really no integration of that confidentiality, that authentication. None of that really exists in these things at this point, until you get, I think, into the higher end devices. So we are starting to see some vendors stepping up their game and providing very high quality stuff in particular, and I'll talk about it in a minute. I think Google owning Nest and Apple's HomeKit stuff is a great move in the right direction for the really consumer-oriented stuff. So we are seeing it move that way. The question in my mind is still whether we have whether consumers will spend the money for security, or whether we're going to continue to have a race to the bottom. Risks, lots and lots of little risks that come at, again, the macro and the micro, right? So big data, huge risk there. You start thinking about, the thermostats and these types of things, and the webcam for that matter, the ability to determine when people may be home, when they may be on vacation, the analysis of huge kinds of data can present risk even for things that seem unimportant, like when the lights are turned on or what temperature your home is set to with the thermostat. In aggregate, that data can be somewhat intrusive. The candle there and the kid with the fan, I really think about, this is the macro-micro thing I keep referring to. I talked to a energy utility executive a few months back who this is the #1 thing that keeps them up at night. They were talking to me about what happens the day that somebody figures out how to hack, say, a Nest thermostat, and a criminal has the ability, or a terrorist, if you want to call them that, has the ability in a given community to turn 25,000 air conditioners on in 1 millisecond. That takes the grid down. When people buy a smart thermostat, they go, oh, who's going to monkey with the temperature at my house? Or so what? Somebody turned the heat all the way up and my ice cream melted, or, this type of thing. They look at it as maybe it's a prank, or maybe it's inconvenient, or at worst case, we look at it, maybe it's a stalker trying to be creepy about something. But when we think about it in the aggregate, it presents real risk to the public infrastructure, whether that be the telephone infrastructure, the cellular infrastructure, the power infrastructure. Finding a vulnerability in a popular thing, even if it's a 3-watt LED light bulb, 20 million 3-watt LED light bulbs actually matter, and that is a very big concern. Clearly, the dog with spy glasses is just there because I thought dogs with spy glasses are cute, but more than that, these devices all often have microphones. So there are fire extinguishers that have microphones built in for self-tests, but it's been shown they could be hacked. I'm looking around me this very moment, and I can see at least 7 cameras in my office that could be remotely enabled, and I wouldn't know unless, like Director Comey, I put tape over them. Not to mention the microphones that are built into all of the things around me that could be turned on without my knowledge, including the smart television and a whole bunch of other things here. So there's certainly a big spy capability, and we've already started to see the abuse of these things for botnets. And this is sort of that silent threat in my mindset, which is the threat that's hard to quantify because you don't know what's happening, right? Your router is conducting a denial of service attack against Chase Bank right now, and you don't really even know that it's been commandeered, because unlike a traditional computer threat or ransomware that tells you you have a problem or the temperature of your home going up, all that instead is happening is you're participating in a criminal service and you don't even know it's happening. Standards, I think, are one way out of fixing a lot of this. There's a lot of good things going on. You can see some examples here of companies that are pushing standards. Of course, Google bought Nest, and Google's launched some new services. They've launched something called Brillo and Weave. They're basically offering an Android-based operating system that is maintained by Google, so arguably they can maintain security and standards and offer it to be embedded in these devices to improve the quality of the security, and a framework on top of that specifically to be lightweight for controlling IoT devices. We see Insteon and Wink kind of starting to do integration to provide consumers with a single app and tool to manage all of their different things. I think that's a good move forward as well. And Apple with their HomeKit initiative, where Apple's gone the extra step of requiring a chip be embedded in devices that can be remotely controlled, that enforces encryption and standards that are set by Apple. That dramatically increases the price of devices, it seems. If you look into the marketplace of devices that are available that support Apple's HomeKit, they're significantly more expensive than many of the things that I played with in my testing. But Apple's able to assure not just quality of their ecosystem, which is obviously part of their brand and their marketing, they're also able to assure quality of security, which is important to many of us as well. And I encourage folks to purchase things that have been vetted and look at some of these standards as a sort of more of a seal of approval. I've also heard of organizations like Underwriters Laboratories looking into providing a certification similar to that we see for the safety and fire resistance of the things that we buy, as to certain security standards having been met. And I think it's really important that we have some way to judge when we're looking at the shelf at the shop on which things we can trust and which things may present more of a gamble as to our security. Frameworks can help as well, although so far the frameworks in much of my testing are more abused than a good thing, but it does provide us at least a single point of focus to try to fix things. So there are companies out there. The one there in the middle is one I've started looking at, GreenWave. There are companies basically saying, hey, you're a device manufacturer in Taiwan or wherever you're at, you want to make a smart thing, we'll run the cloud, we'll provide you with an operating system or an API to put into your smart thing. Here's a set of different embedded controllers you can use in your device, and we'll handle the software. That's not to say that these companies don't have flaws in their framework, but it's starting to look a lot like Internet of Things as a service, right? You make your things smart. There'll be a few companies offering to smartify manufacturers' devices, and while they may not be great at it this very minute, hopefully if they're open to working with researchers, that gives us a single point to maybe fix security problems in a whole swath of devices. So if I find an issue with the way GreenWave handles something and report it to them responsibly, they can fix it, and it may fix 100 different smart light bulb companies or that kind of thing, right? So we may have a bigger impact that way by having some of these shared frameworks. So I don't think they're ideal right now. I think it's a good point of focus for us to look at the future development of these devices in a safer, more secure way. And if these companies focus on security more, that may be another one of those badges you can look for when you buy something, and you can say, you know what, I know that Kaizen takes security seriously. If this device uses the Kaizen framework, I'm okay with bringing it into my organization because I know it's been vetted and that they welcome security feedback. Lastly, defense. I really wanted to have a much richer slide to present to you on defense, and because of how everything was broken differently, it was very challenging for me to come up with any ubiquitous advice. Certainly splitting and segregating and being careful with Wi-Fi authentication seems to be a very high priority. We've seen many different devices be able to be compromised and give up the password, the Wi-Fi they're connected to. None of these devices typically support certificate authentication, so that's always a big problem. Separating those networks wherever possible is really, really helpful. And one way that you can find out whether that's possible sometimes is to look at the packaging and decide on the packaging whether something says that it relies on the cloud or it relies on an app, or whether it also says it's compatible with PC and Mac. If it says it's compatible with PC and Mac, that usually indicates that it doesn't necessarily need to be on the same network. You can access it from a web browser, that kind of thing, or maybe it's cloud controlled through a web interface, but that usually means it can be isolated and doesn't need to be on the same network. And universal PMP, if it's on anywhere in your networks, it really needs to be off. Anything that turns off your security by asking nicely is a bad idea. Thirdly, firmware, and this is a really tough one, but keeping the firmware on these things up to date is critical. Most of them that I play with don't seem to have auto update functionality enabled by default. That's a big problem. That's a thing I think we need to address with manufacturers. The one smart light bulb actually did, so for the first time in my life, I actually updated the software on a light bulb. That's good. We need to encourage more of that because that's a big vulnerability in these things. They are being shipped to get to market early, which means they're being shipped with flaws. And keeping them up to date is critical if the manufacturers stay in business long enough to fix them. The next one there, the comic is about password entropy, and that means you cannot share passwords with these devices. There's nothing wrong with having a sheet of paper under a magnet on the fridge in the break room or in your kitchen that lists all the passwords for your Internet of Things devices that they use to connect to the cloud. I'm really not worried about a burglar coming into your house so he can control your light bulbs. That's probably not going to happen. Don't worry about it. What's worse is that you share that password with Facebook or some other thing, because these devices insecurity means they will give up the password and can give up the password, and many of them do it almost intentionally. They just send it across the internet unencrypted. So it's super, super risky even to use your, quote, throwaway password, because now you've thrown away all those accounts. So you really have to have something separate for them. And literally during testing, that's precisely what I did. Is I have a sheet of paper that lists each thing I played with and a password written down. And they're not the best passwords in the world, but they're all different. And that's a critical component. Run your own cloud. That's why there's a little house in a terribly drawn cloud. Many of these things allow you to run them only in your house. Don't be tempted to connect them to the cloud. They are insecure, and if you can keep them in your own house, it can be fun, and they're cool gadgets. And having something that sends you a tweet when your plant needs to be watered is kind of clever and cute, and maybe a fun project to work on with your kids. But allowing those things to directly rely upon other cloud services where they do share things like passwords and potentially Wi-Fi connectivity and other types of information, I find very discomforting. And lastly, if you don't need to connect it, don't. And my smart TV testing kind of made that point to me. The only useful thing my smart TV really does is it has a web browser and it has Netflix. And guess what? I have an Xbox. It has a web browser and it has Netflix. And I've got a phone with a Roku, and it has a web browser, and it has Netflix. How many things do I need to play Netflix? It's easier for me to just not connect my television and not worry about the security, whether it's running Android or Tizen or WebOS. What difference does it really make? If I don't need the functionality of something, then the safest thing to do is cut the cord. And on that note, I'll hand it over to Jessica and see if she has any questions I can address. I invite all of you to ask any questions you may have, or feel free to follow up with me after the webcast as well. I'm always happy to chat.
Chester, thank you so much for that great presentation. I know that I could, relate to a lot of it, especially the Netflix thing that you just said. I don't have a smart TV, but I definitely use a Roku and everything, so I think it's very a topic that everyone can really relate to. There are some questions that have come in. I'll go ahead and start with one of the first ones that we received, which I can also relate to because my brother has a Fitbit. What are your thoughts on how secure those are?
Yeah, Fitbit's interesting. I carry a Fitbit as well, and one of the things I learned early on about Fitbit is that it will connect to anything that's Fitbit enabled around it and communicate all of the data from it. So I was at a conference actually here in Vancouver called CanTech West, and I logged into my Fitbit app and noticed that my steps had been updated even though I had Bluetooth off on my phone. And I'm like, that's really weird. And it turns out my Fitbit was talking to some guy's Macintosh on the table next to me because he had the Fitbit software enabled. Most of these really small wearables have no genuine security to them. The way you can tell whether they have any security to them actually, since most of them are Bluetooth enabled, is whether they require you to put in a 5-digit or 6-digit code, like when you pair something to your car, right? If you pair your iPhone to your car these days, you always get that thing that goes, hey, the 6-digit code is blah, make sure that's what it shows on your phone before you press OK to pair this. That's it that's it attempting to set up the encryption properly over Bluetooth. So that's the first step to knowing whether something can be secure. Of course, at least the Fitbit I carry, which is a very, very old one, I'm not trying to pick on Fitbit here, doesn't do any of that, right? It pairs with the 4 zeros, which is the default, which means anything can intercept the communications and understand what is being sent. and it's up to you, I guess, to decide whether your steps and heart rate are something that you consider personal or not.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. The next question, and we do have quite a few questions to get through, so if you have any, please send them through the Q&A feature on the WebEx, and we'll get to as many as we can. The next question has to do with ransomware. So at our WebEx on ransomware, someone asked about ransoming high-value IoT devices like smart or self-driving cars or medical devices. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm afraid that's probably not too far down the road now that somebody had the good idea to make that a public suggestion. Obviously, security to obscurity is not the answer, but I personally wear a medical device that could be used to kill me. I have an insulin pump. I'm a type 1 diabetic, and so I've looked at this rather carefully. I guess it could happen, right? I mean, there's nothing, software, and there's really nothing to stop it from happening. The real issues you have to look at are how practical it is and how you gather the ransom. So if you look at how PCs are used with ransomware, the most important thing for the criminal typically is to not disable your computer. They never encrypt the operating system, for example, because they need a way to tell you how to pay the ransom, and they need your computer to work well enough for you to be able to go pay the ransom. If I ransom your medical device, how do I communicate to you, and how do I identify you as a victim even to know to send you the ransom message? Like if I want 50 grand to not kill you, I need to be able to display a message telling you I have control of your insulin pump, and that's a rather challenging thing with medical devices, fortunately. So unless you're just sadistic and want to kill people, I think that it's limited on medical. The cars, you know, again, I'm not really sure how you would communicate to the given car owner that they're the victim unless maybe you leave a literal ransom note on the windscreen or the windshield. But that's a challenge too, because now you've increased your physical risk of being caught, which most of these criminals love, being able to prey on us from afar. So I don't think it's impossible, and I certainly doubt that it won't happen. I'm sure someone will, if nothing else, to prove it can be done. But I think the practical aspects are most ransom stuff is dependent upon high value, lots of victims handing over lots of money. And these would have to be pretty personal attacks and would present a higher risk to the criminal. So I don't think they'll be widespread.
Great, thank you. I do have 2 or 3 other questions here. So I think in your presentation you were talking about smart light bulbs, and someone had a question about which smart light bulb provided an update.
Yeah, I think the one I showed a screenshot of the package, the TCP brand one, actually downloaded a firmware update from the app on Android. So using the device itself didn't tell me anything, but then one day when I launched the application to control the light bulb, it popped up and said there was firmware available and actually applied it to the light bulbs over Zigbee.
Okay, thank you. And I think you touched on this, but there was a question that came in. What can consumers do now to find out if a device is secure until there are standards?
Sadly, almost nothing, other than don't buy it and go turn your lights on and off at the switch. Unless you're willing to do the kinds of things I did and buy the thing and start sniffing the radio and sniffing the packets across the network and analyzing them, there's very little that can be done. Aside from maybe reading blogs and things, do your research, right? A lot of researchers are looking at these things and blogging about flaws they're finding. Another thing you can often look at is how a vendor's reputation is for responding to vulnerability reports. So this is one of the reasons I praised Nest a little bit, in that a few people I know have reported vulnerabilities to Nest, and within a day they've gotten, not just responded, but gotten back and said, here's a test patch, try this, does it fix, does it actually stop you from compromising our device? There seemed to be a partnership attitude, and much of that has been made public by the researchers because we like being treated well when we disclose vulnerabilities. So I think there's a little bit of a reputation being built, but it's such early days. Aside from trusting people like myself, when you look for blog articles and things about brands, it's pretty hard.
Okay, thank you. And the last question that I have in the queue for right now, again, if you have any, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A section. It goes back to the Fitbit conversation. So is there any database of how private data can be abused, i.e. how your Fitbit steps could possibly be used?
Yeah, no database yet. I mean, that would certainly be an interesting idea to put together almost a wiki for deviant thoughts on how you might manipulate someone's information to do things. I'm not aware of that. I personally am not that concerned. Hence, I'm carrying a Fitbit because I kind of like to know how much exercise I've gotten in a day running back and forth in the terminal of an airport or wherever I may be. And I don't really see much harm in that at this time. Now, certainly there's been concern more about things like heart rate sensors, that kind of thing, where it could be used to determine that maybe you have some sort of a medical condition by analyzing microsecond data that can often be gathered by these devices about heart arrhythmia, these types of things. The other side that I've heard on the quantified self type devices, which is kind of the generic name for the Fitbits and heart monitors and things, is the idea that could be abused by insurance companies to raise prices, that type of thing. Again, there's no evidence that that's happened, but we've already started to see, these devices you plug into your car determine whether you drive too fast or you slam on the brakes or these types of things, maybe raising or lowering your car insurance rates. And I don't think it's far-fetched to think that you told us that you do a 5K twice a week, but your Fitbit says you don't, so we're raising your rates.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that's a really a hot topic now. So we are getting a couple other questions, so let me go ahead and see if we can get through them before we conclude today. The first one that came in since a few minutes ago was, do you know if there are CVEs being created for IoT devices?
There's no reason they won't be created, but I haven't seen very many. And the MITRE, the company that administers CVEs, my understanding is struggling to keep up with just issuing them for common computer software that we're all using. So I don't think doing a CVE search in any way would be definitive as to whether a device has had flaws. But if you were to report a vulnerability, I don't see any reason you wouldn't request one.
Okay, and we'll end with this one. I think it's kind of a general question. I think you might have mentioned it in your presentation. What is meant by run your own cloud?
Well, run devices within your own home and consider keeping things on-site instead of off-site. And I mean, that's more of a generic piece of advice around privacy in general. For example, rather than using a cloud-based file sharing service, maybe use one you can run on your NAS if you have a network-attached storage device, or maybe that's built into your router. Many things include this type of functionality now. Like I use an open-source tool called OwnCloud that is sort of a Dropbox clone that I can run on my own network at my house. And in this case, I was thinking more about the things like the web camera, where instead of running it through the manufacturer's cloud for me to access it remotely, instead I log into my router and then I access it through my router on my own network. So it's sort of still available to me in the cloud, but it's still available to me when I'm remote, but I'm not necessarily sending all my information off to a third party.
Okay, great. If anyone has any additional questions, we'd be happy to be the middleman with Chester here. So if you wanted to send an email with any additional questions to info@msisec.org, please feel free to do that, and we'll go ahead and send them over to Chester to get some responses on those. With that, I wanted to thank everyone for joining us today for the April MSISEC National Webcast on the Internet of Things. Chester, thank you so much for an excellent and informative session. Just a few reminders for attendees. The next MSISEC National Webcast is scheduled for Wednesday, June 22nd at 2 p.m. Eastern, so please save the date on that. The topic is going to be the CIS Critical Security Controls. We got a couple questions today in regards to how people can locate the webcast recording for today's event. That will be located and archived on the MSISEC website, including the question and answer session. So feel free to go to msisec.ceisecurity.org to, within a couple days of the live event, to view that webcast recording. And that will conclude our event today. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us for the event. And Chester, thank you so much for your time, for a great presentation.
Thank you, and thanks for all the questions.
All right. Have a great day, everybody.